Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Progressively Incorrect. My name is Zach Rochelle, and we have an amazing episode all about some of the top things and questions that have been confusing me in the world of early literacy. And so I'm going to be talking with Jamey Peavler in just a moment. But first, I wanted to plug something you may not have heard about just yet, and that is my Explicit Teaching Institute in the Inwood area of New York City this summer, last week of July. I'd love for you to come out in 2026 when this episode aired and do a full week-long institute with me. There's a lot of active rehearsal and participation. I'm going to make you use scripts. We're going to do a lot of deliberate practice together. And there's also just time to kind of get to know other educators because tickets are selling fast. And I just want you to come and enjoy the city with me. My family will be there. So check out the Eventbrite link in the show notes for the Explicit Teaching Institute. You'll notice it's about half the price of every other thing that's like this. I think that's important for me. So come on and join that event. So without further ado, Jamey, it is so good to finally have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm doing really well. I have a little dirt under my fingernails from playing in the yard this morning, but other than that, we're good.
Is this playing with kids or is this gardening?
This is gardening.
Oh, yeah, nice.
It's therapy.
Yeah,
therapy
nice.
Gardening.
We're going to be talking all about the work that you've been doing. I know we have some crossover with some of the people we know. Tell us about yourself, like what you're all about for listeners that don't know your work.
Well, I'm all about preventing people from making the same instructional mistakes that I did as a classroom teacher. So I was a public school teacher in Indianapolis Public Schools for more than 20 years. Most of that time was elementary, a little bit in middle school setting, and then eventually in the department, English Language Arts department. And I'm someone who about 7 years into my teaching career realized I had no idea what I was doing. For the first 7 years, I thought I was doing great, but that's because I was delivering the lessons. I wasn't really paying attention to whether the students were making any progress. And it was actually my 7th year of teaching when one of my students told me I didn't know what I was doing. And that was just a little bit of a wake-up call for me to do something about it. And so I eventually took an Orton Gillingham course, which at least taught me the concepts of language. Crazy to think that an elementary school would not really, have a teacher who knew that. But the other thing that I feel like brings me to where I am now is that led me to realize that I wasn't the only one in that situation. So I had to go find the research and the information on my own. So now I teach at Mount St. Joseph University and the Graduate Reading Science program, again, hoping to prevent some of the same experiences that I had.
Man, oh man, I have not had anyone on the podcast who's been like, yeah, I was trained to teach the thing that I was meant to teach. That's so similar experiences. And I have a load of questions for you that we have to like unpick some of these things that I think we use some similar words, but we don't mean all the same thing. And the first thing I wanted to dig in with you was around, you make a distinction between like an exposure-based model of instruction so that everyone can like access grade level instruction. And then there's like maybe like an access model. Can you tell me a little bit about that distinction?
So exposure-based instruction to me is everyone's getting close to the same thing, and that type of instruction tends to be grounded in state standards. So for instance, as a third grade teacher, I might know that there are comprehension standards that all of my students are supposed to be exposed to, and I'm going to dutifully check the list that I've covered those things. And then the idea is that if we teach all of those standards and we expose kids to the content, then those students that are not performing or reaching basic levels of proficiency, well, we can fix that in an intervention. So they'll get something different to close the gap, but everybody gets exposed to the same grade level content. And so that model often looks like more of an old RTI model where everybody gets the same core. And then we might go off and work with another teacher and get something that's a little more customized to what data indicate that we need for tier 2 or tier 3. Access-based instruction is, as I explain it, is more, I should be getting the instruction that reflects my current performance levels at all times. That doesn't mean that a classroom teacher is expected to have like 6 different lessons going on in a block. That's just not possible. And it's not necessary, to be honest with you. But there are some skills that really do have to develop in a sequential way and that we can't bypass when students don't have the essential prerequisites. So if at any point in time I am going to find myself teaching a lesson that students in my classroom do not have the prerequisite skills to be successful in, I should not be exposing them to that content just for the sake of checking the box. If I know it's going to create cognitive overload because they are not prepared, because it will create confusion, because it will create frustration, then I should, instead of exposing them, I should replace that instruction with the instruction that they can access along the continuum so that they eventually can benefit from the instruction that I'm providing the rest of the students. So again, access to me is meeting them where they are if the skills are essential because they're prerequisites or foundational, whereas exposure is, I'm just going to give you the same thing whether you're ready or not.
It's interesting. There's a lot of different things, that little component kind of questions that are within that broader area. I'm just gonna kind of rattle some of them off, and you know this better than I am. Does this relate to like constrained versus unconstrained skills, in the sense that perhaps you use a different strategy for teaching those, and maybe you could define those for us as well, so we kind of know what those things are.
Yes. Okay. So let's start with unconstrained skills. So unconstrained skills are skills that really, there's no linear progression in terms of how they develop. And so if I think about literacy for a moment, to me, that would be more comprehension oriented. So it doesn't really matter as a student if I am taught the vocabulary words that I need to understand the passage before I'm taught some of the background knowledge that I need that the author assumed that I have. So that order doesn't necessarily matter. Nor does it really matter if I've, got a really solid understanding of, plant and animal systems before we get to the volcano unit. That really wouldn't matter. But unconstrained skills are, again, things that some kids are still going to struggle with in a heterogeneous grouping if, as the classroom teacher, I'm not anticipating where problems may occur. So I still, within an unconstrained setting, may need to do some customization and some front loading and some additional scaffolding and support for some of my students. But in general, we're all pretty close to being on the same, playing field. Whereas with constrained skills, think about, again, this is a continuum, a progression, and where you are in the continuum matters. It's not that, we can just throw these skills up and see where they land. There is a definite intentional order in which skills need to be taught. And so when we think about literacy, a lot of that falls into word recognition. So how well can I decode a passage? So simply because I'm a third grader doesn't mean that, me and all of my peers can decode the same passage. What we can decode is going to be really dependent upon which skills we're all bringing to the table. And so if I am in this continuum at the lower end of development, and perhaps I'm still struggling to sound out single syllable words, but my peers are proficient with multisyllabic words and complex words with prefixes and suffixes in them, we are not in the same place in the continuum. And so putting us in a situation where we are all expected to do the same thing is actually going to be problematic. And so when it comes to constrained skills, they are definitely sequential. They are easy to isolate, which for assessment purposes, that's really nice. For instructional purposes, that's also pretty easy. But we can't put students in an exposure model when it comes to constrained skills and expect them to learn as effectively as if we meet them where they are in the continuum. And so for some third graders, if, sticking with this example, I am further back in the earlier stages of the continuum, I'm going to need you to do something for me to close that gap and catch me up. So then an acceleration model is something that we might look at in that instance.
It seems like you're kind of referring to like two schools of thought when it comes to differentiation. That's what it sounds like. There's one which I kind of call like teach to the top, I guess, where you plan a learning objective that everybody needs to meet in the lesson, and you then teach it like as efficiently as possible. My advice would be use explicit instruction, and you model it. You have, you check for understanding. You make sure that everyone shows you on their mini whiteboards. Then finally, you go into independent practice, at which time that might occasion a further response that's within the teacher's logistical like control, which is all right, let's go back to the kidney table. Let's get, Mark, Sammy, Alan back to the kidney table, and we might give them a little bit more time on task, and maybe there's a opportunity to loop in maybe a specialist that can give them a little bit more instruction, and then you sort of increase time on task for like a small number of kids based on really great kind of tier one, or I guess whole group instruction. But it just seems like especially when we talk about these constrained skills, that model just cannot work, because you're going to spend the entire time out of sequence way down the line for certain kids when they need an entirely different intervention, which would mean like homogeneous grouping. Am I right about like kind of how I'm positioning that?
Exactly. That's the distinction. So if it's minor cleaning up and a little bit of support and a little bit of hand holding, then that's not something that we have to do on a large scale. That's just, to me, like really triaging, just kind of inserting ourselves to support where needed. This differentiation that I'm talking about with homogeneous skill-based grouping is more around a model that we're familiar with in a high school setting. For example, in high school, if I'm learning a second language, I am not, as a senior, going to be placed in Spanish 7-8 if I've never taken Spanish 1, 2, or 3, 4. That wouldn't make any sense. So when it comes to constrained skills, very much like learning a foreign language, we have to start in the same place, and we have to systematically build those skills up. That's the difference between constrained being very homogeneous groupings targeted, and unconstrained being more dynamic, heterogeneous groupings with a little bit of intensified supports when needed.
So specifically with reading, like what does that look like? And I kind of maybe like describe the student experience, the adult experience, the logistical considerations that need to go into setting something. Maybe like a concrete example would like illuminate this for the audience.
Yeah. So I think it's best to start off with the simple view of reading, kind of as a framework to anchor this model to. So in the simple view of reading, we look at reading comprehension as the outcome that we all are aiming for, but it really is dependent upon a proficiency level of word recognition skills. And I'm going to add to that word recognition skills transcription, because again, it seems less responsible of us to just talk about reading and not talk about written expression. So if we talk about word recognition as an essential component of being a skilled reader, I would say transcription and encoding and spelling falls into that same bucket too. Our language comprehension being the other bucket of skills that we're developing is again also parallel to composition, coming up with ideas and organizing and communicating. So if we take that framework and we stick with word recognition and transcription, that's the majority of our constrained skills. And so within a literacy framework in a building, we might say in an elementary school setting that teachers have to have 90 minutes of a reading block. That's a pretty common time, recommendation. So if we have a 90-minute block, what we would do in this situation is we would split it into maybe 30 to 45 minutes of word recognition and transcription. And in that model, students would go off to their just right lesson with their just right teacher. So we'd have to share kids. So there's an adult component here that gets a little messy that we can talk about. But when it comes to language comprehension and composition and writing about what we're reading about, we'd go back to our homeroom, because those differences in skills are not going to be barriers if the teacher knows how to support them effectively. But the differences in skills in word recognition and transcription, those are barriers. I can't access the text if I can't decode it. There's nothing for me to comprehend. I can't demonstrate my understanding of subject matter in writing if I don't have the transcription skills to spell the words or the handwriting to write legibly and fluently. And so if we separate that block into those two components, then we are going to be able to differentiate with homogeneous skill-based groupings in word recognition and keep our grade level instruction, so more of our exposure model teaching, in our language comprehension and composition block.
I don't think Tim Shanahan intentionally caused this issue, but I think that the book that's been going around, the sort of leveled lives, leveled readers, may have allowed some people to interpret that as, look, we just got to keep them all together at all times, because if they're going to lose out on exposure to high level vocabulary and sentence structure that comes from British spellings and all all this rich background knowledge that every kid deserves to have access to. There's also sort of like this knowledge rich, like kind of Hersheyan argument that we should all be like have a shared common language and understanding of some of the same key terms. But then it sort of misses out on how reading, especially with constrained skills, how reading develops and how what we've learned over the past many decades of how to teach those skills. Am I right? Am I right of how I'm thinking about
Yes,
that?
exactly. And I think we have made it more complicated than it needs to be by kind of having this argument, because really both perspectives are right. We do have to expose kids to knowledge and vocabulary and advanced sentence structure, but do they have to independently read it for that to be exposure? Can it not be done through a read aloud, which levels the playing field for all the students in the classroom? And I think we're still in a place in education where people think reading out loud to kids, especially as they get older, is somehow cheating. And it's not. Then, when we think about our own children, I read out loud to my children texts that there's no way they could read on their own. And they have the benefit of hearing the vocabulary and the knowledge and asking questions. But if I forced them to independently read that text, I did create a barrier for them that is harmful. And we have the responsibility to do no harm. And I can't help but, stress that having spent 20 years in a classroom setting as a teacher, and now having one foot in and one foot out as an action-based researcher, we are causing harm for a lot of kids when we are putting content in front of them that just reinforces reading is hard. I don't like it. I'm not as smart as my friends. So I think when we separate that word recognition piece and transcription piece out, and we meet them where they are, they now have the opportunity to become proficient in skills that would have left them further behind if we tried to equal reading comprehension and language comprehension, listening comprehension, and word recognition. We need to decouple them. I think we need to get past this idea that reading is one thing, and we have to look at the complexities of the skills and tasks involved in reading.
You know what this also resolves for me, and I've been saying this a lot, and nobody likes it, of course. But there has now been, I'm not sure how much you've been into the social media stuff, but there's been a lot of talk about over-teaching phonics skills, And for me, as someone who's run a lot of these kind of MTSS style type of immersion based literacy programs where you're going into homogeneous groups, perhaps you have a resource that's leveled is my what I would always suggest you need to do so that you can actually place them within a scope and sequence and so on. I'll throw in my good friend Stephanie Staller in here. I think you guys should listen to her episode. I think it's a good explanation of that type of model. Saying that we're over teaching phonics within that paradigm makes no sense. Like, it's like, how could you possibly do so? I guess it's technically possible, but how could you do that when you're using assessment and you are placing kids based on need, which often leads to your most vulnerable kids getting a lot more of what they need in terms of phonics instruction? How could you possibly be over teaching this? I don't know why this question stresses me, but am I right? Am I in the right direction with this one?
I love that you're asking it, because I can tell you that I am seeing some places where there is too much phonics instruction happening. And what that looks like in those settings is back to exposure. Everybody's getting the same phonics lesson in core. And for the students who are pretty significantly behind, they're getting a double dose of phonics. And because that's not enough to move the needle and increase the slope, they might be getting a third pass. But what's problematic is often those double and triple scoops are really not aligned to what data indicate that the student actually needs. It's just a matter of they got this in core, and this is our tier 2 curriculum, and this is our tier 3. So they are having a lot of phonics time, but they're not getting a big return on their investment. So if a school is doing that, then I usually do stress to them that we've got phonics overkill here. And what we need to do is figure out why our first pass isn't working, because no child should have to need 120 minutes of phonics instruction. And so, and no child wants 120 minutes of phonics instruction. So what we first have to do is figure out why the core isn't working. And often it comes down to it was an exposure model. And I do believe a lot of schools think that that is what they are legally obligated to do, especially when you look at, special education policy. And a lot of special education policy for the kids that we're concerned about say students need to have access to grade level content. But again, I want to stress that they use the word access. They do not use the word exposure. And so in that code, I have never met an attorney who just arbitrarily picked words. There's usually a lot of careful consideration in the specific words they use. And so I firmly believe that the word access was intentional. They need to have access to grade level content. They need to have access to appropriate content. But having access doesn't mean that you just sit there as a passive observer. It means you're actively engaging. And with the constrained skills of word recognition, you may have to actively engage several lessons back from where we would expect the grade level to be. It's no different than sitting at a meal, or watching a sports game. I can have exposure to the game. Doesn't mean I got any benefit. I didn't play. I didn't move my body. I could have gotten exposure to a meal, but I couldn't actually eat it because it didn't meet my nutritional needs. But access is different. Access is I am engaging, I'm participating, I'm benefiting from, and they use the word access. So I think first is getting to why is core not working? It's probably exposure and not access. And then what does tier 2 and tier 3 look like? Because hopefully tier 3 isn't needed once we fix core. And once we fix core, tier 2 becomes really, in the most part, a second pass, meaning that I don't need something different. But if I, as an example, am back on lesson 12 in a curriculum, a phonics, scope and sequence, but my peers on grade level are at lesson 60, I have a gap to close. And the only way I'm going to close that gap is through acceleration. So I should be getting lesson 12 in the morning and hopefully lesson 13 in my intervention in the afternoon. And tomorrow I would get 14 and then I would get 15. And over time, we do start to close that gap. So I do think there are places where kids are getting too much phonics instruction. And I think in that situation, it's because they're not getting the right phonics instruction.
I think that sums it up perfectly for me. We've been saying the taboo word this whole time, which has been differentiation, and it reminds me of a couple of things. A lot of weird mutations that came out of differentiation. We know that we sort of had to analyze all sorts of weird student variables like learning styles in the past, and there was also this view of basically the teacher is capable of designing 30 individualized personalized
Right.
lessons at a time, but then there's also sort of the fixed track type of model that we could call tracking, where kids are basically locked into I was at a school where they had this room, they called it the warrior room, right? And it was sort of like you're locked into this room and you can't get out, and you're not able to ever aspire to greater things or catch up with your peers, and you might even be given maybe the weakest teacher and not enough support and so on. So how is what you're talking about different than some of those mutations of differentiation?
Yeah, I like that you asked that. I know I often call that residency. So if a child is in residence and they are never moving out of this, targeted intervention, we have an instructional problem that as adults we have to go look at. Because tracking is when we make a predetermined decision about what a child is capable of, and we set up an environment that holds them in that place. And so what this is database decision making in real time and in a realistic setting. Because no, a classroom teacher, and I've never met a classroom teacher who can effectively plan, deliver, implement, monitor multiple lessons at one time. And, I would like to think that my time in the classroom eventually towards the end of my career was pretty successful. I couldn't do that. And I don't think that it's reasonable to ask teachers to do that. What I think we need to do is look at our block as a whole and look at our resources and share kids. And so if we are sharing kids, then what we're doing is dividing up certain points in the scope and sequence that are ideal entry points based on the data that we've collected. And we put students in their just right placement in that entry point for instruction. And then again, those students who have the furthest journey to make get the double dip, or more intensification to close that gap. And as data show that they're making progress, then we start moving students around. And so they don't necessarily stay in a group forever. They stay in that group as long as that group is meeting their needs, and then they move on. But if we're accelerating those students who are the furthest behind by giving them a double dip, then they don't stay far behind anymore. They start to get closer to where all of the students in that grade level are supposed to be. But in a tracking model where kids have this predetermined decision, very rarely do we see an acceleration model in place. And so those students do stay far behind. We usually don't change the future for those kids. That's tracking. In skill-based grouping that's data-driven, the future is very much about getting them close to where they need to be. It is not a predetermined decision. It's a data-based observation and response system.
And so I can picture how this looks in elementary, because I can just talk to this person across the way. We can share our spreadsheet. We might have an MTSS coordinator or something that's like in charge of just making sure that, you constantly in this model get someone saying, we just got a new student. We crudely placed her. This group is not right for her, whether she's just bored in it, or she's not on signal for any of the choral responses or whatever. We just talk to each other, we get along, and we work as a team. What happens when you get to middle school and now there's 6 teachers, and we have kids who have been chronically absent, chronically underserved by the system, and have not been identified for any need, but they cannot access the grade level text of that year at all. Like they can't decode words. What do we do in this case?
Yeah, we still apply the logic of constrained and unconstrained skills, and then we have to talk to our subject matter teachers. So if we start with the subject matter teachers, the first thing we have to do is make sure they're aware of what barriers are going to be, issues to address for that child. So what are the barriers that will prevent them from learning the content? Well, does the teacher make the child read the text independently? Because that's a barrier. Like they're not going to understand biology, or they're not going to understand US history or any of their coursework if the teacher is expecting that. So how are we going to remove that barrier? The other one is, how are they expected to demonstrate understanding? So again, if they can't access grade level text to decode it, they are not going to be able to transcribe their responses either to demonstrate understanding. So that's a barrier. How are we going to remove it? And so that really makes the case for why a lot of our middle and high school teachers need more training and understanding in the importance of explicit instruction. Because often when we get to middle and high school, all of a sudden discovery learning or independent learning is the way that we go. And no, when we are teaching subject matter content, we need to do it explicitly. We just, again, need to support them to understand the literacy barriers. For our ELA teachers, this is where we have to go back to that idea of constrained skills and placing students in their just right level. So when it comes time to create a master schedule and the individual student schedules in middle and high school, we have to treat the ELA block like the foreign language block. So what level of ELA instruction are they in? Now in middle school, in a lot of places, we don't have to worry about credits. It's not until high school that comes into play. So in middle school, I might be in period 1 in 7th grade because the period 1 class is working on some pretty foundational phonics concepts that I need. And if in period 1, we have a well-designed scope and sequence and a teacher who understands explicit instruction and how to manipulate forms of practice and give feedback and opportunities to respond, those kids should grow. They may also need an additional study hall resource period as a triage to clean up the things that they're having difficulty with. But that's the model that we would want to use in a middle school setting so that, again, all year, if you're in period 1, maybe period 1 is the period that is, 45 minutes of content backed up to the homeroom period, and they actually stay in there too because they need a longer period of time because they have more content to learn. Whereas the period 2 ELA kids are a little more advanced, and so maybe they don't have that same instructional need. So that would be the model to put in place when we have these, subject specific courses and a period type schedule where students are constantly changing classrooms and educators all day long.
And is there a role within that day for basically a middle school intervention type of program for reading? And I'm thinking like just the ones I've had used are like corrective reading or rewards or like this is what happens is that people feel bad about the kid loses something. They lose PE or they lose art, but they get intensive programmatic instruction in skills that either they just their elementary school failed them in or they just simply needed a lot more intensive instruction in that and they're in sixth grade and they do you see a role of that in the model?
I do, yeah. And I think, again, to first minimize that they have to give something up, like an elective up. That's why we have to place them in their just right ELA block, because that's where they should be getting most of their instruction anyway. No need to sit through something that doesn't meet their needs. But if they do need an additional intervention, yes, a school-wide intervention block is great. Everybody needs help with something. And so, if everyone is going to their just right placement, it could be enrichment, it could be intervention, very much like we did a win, a what I need time in elementary. And that way, no one is giving up an elective. That's always a good model. What's nice in a middle school setting is you can have a much shorter period for that. I'm working with some schools that because of a split lunch period, they do that. That split lunch period often has a 20 extra minute time in the class that got interrupted for lunch. Maybe that's the period that they should be getting their, intervention because they got 20 extra minutes.
Awesome. The questions that come up around this just seem like you can solve them. Like we can all be adults and like figure this out. But it's always like things like, my school's too small. My school is too big. I can't have this many groups. And then there's a lot of just adult comfort concerns that come up in this. I've never taught that before. I only do this, or I prefer not to do that, or even I'm contractually obligated to not have to do that, right? And so, how do you manage or persuade whole groups of people to row the boat in the same direction so that we can get more win time for kids?
Right. Well, it's interesting because that always comes up. And once we start articulating around the table what problems we're dealing with and what are the barriers for getting students what they need, it almost always results in the people who have pushed back the most being most aligned to the right solutions. Because I think so much of the comfort around holding on to what's familiar is because we don't feel heard. And so as long as we're all talking to each other and being heard, then I find that most people are willing to consider a solution. The one thing that has been, in my experience, the most challenging is getting some educators to trust their colleagues, especially when we're talking about sharing kids. So if I know I am responsible for a group of students, I'm not always comfortable sharing my students with my colleague who I perceive as not working as hard as me, not being as skilled as I am, not having great classroom management, maybe not the best communicator. And so that's when this becomes an administrator issue. Because as a classroom teacher, I can't solve that. I need an administrator to articulate and reaffirm and monitor what the expectations are. The expectations of, we are all doing this can't be something that teachers impose on each other. I also need help with coaching to make sure that I trust that you are as skilled as I am. And that's something that I use calibration as an activity task with schools to help establish that trust. And often what that looks like is pulling out components of a lesson. So let's say a phonics lesson. So maybe there are routines in the lesson that are a little harder or that I see some inconsistencies with. I'll pull the team together and we will role play. I'm going to be the teacher, you be the student, teach me this part of the lesson, and then let's switch roles. And then after we both have a turn, we talk about what was similar, and if there were any differences, we address those. And often what comes out of that is we realize that, my peer is actually not doing so bad with this. Or, ooh, I forgot this thing, and I'm benefiting from them reminding me. And so that builds the trust. It also builds the consistency for the students so that when they do have to switch groups, it's not a reset for them. It's just a continuation. Because the research around cognitive load, which I'm so interested in, is that when routines and procedures vary, then that becomes the focus of the learning and the content gets set aside, and we can't afford that. So we need to be consistent in our routines and procedures on a daily basis in our curriculum, but also across classrooms when we're using the same curriculum, because the student shouldn't have to adjust the way they interact in a lesson because you and I want to do things differently. And so I think that calibration part is a key part to getting people into this idea of being more comfortable with sharing students.
Yeah, yeah. And I would hope that as the data comes in too, it's like, I understand at first it was uncomfortable. Like I have to stand in the hallway and I have to see my kids out to walk to Mr. Smith's class. I have to receive a group of kids that I'm not quite familiar with just yet. And I have to spend a lot of time building new relationships. And I understand there's like that friction, right? And it would just be so much easier and simpler if we just kept everyone together in my class. And especially if you're like me, I would say I was a very controlling teacher in terms of my environment, But the data starts coming in and you start to see kids in this model. I have seen scores double in the first year, right? Like it's almost like not even hard to do that because it's like if we just get a lot of great practices in place, a lot of opportunities to respond, a lot of enthusiasm from the teachers, you can get students to move. Then it just seems like that should be motivation on its own. And so have you seen through the working through this model, this kind of win time approach, this approach to differentiation, those successes with the schools you've been working with?
Yes, and in fact, what's interesting is one of the conversations to get teachers to, consider this is starting with, let's talk about your kids. Let's talk about the kids in your classroom who are making a lot of progress. Why do you think they're making progress? They will tell you why. The lesson's meeting their needs. They participate. They're engaged. Okay, let's talk about the kids that are not making progress. Okay, why? Well, they're really confused. They don't participate. They put their head down. They're a behavior problem. Why might that be happening? It's usually back to cognitive load. The lesson wasn't meeting their needs. So once we start to skill-based group and put kids in their just right placement, one of the first things teachers comment on is the amount of behavior challenges that I have experienced have greatly diminished. Not because the kids who are behavior problems aren't in my classroom anymore. I'm actually teaching the group of kids that has a lot of those behavior problems, but they're not a behavior problem because the lesson is actually something that is at their level. They're feeling success. They're experiencing success. I'm not having to tell them to participate anymore. They want to participate. And so not only does the dynamic of the classroom change, but we do start to see an uptick in growth, especially for the students who were not appropriately placed when we were all doing the same lesson. And so whether it's the students who accelerated and actually got to skip ahead to a harder lesson, or whether it was the students who had to go back several lessons to where their current performance level is, those two outlying groups tend to have the most growth in that model. And what's often surprising to schools is we've kind of accepted that the kids who are advanced don't really grow a lot. It's like, well, of course, there's nowhere to go. There is. If we give them access to the next, skill in the scope and sequence, there's no end to where they can go. We just haven't given them that opportunity. But it's the kids that keep us up at night that are so far behind that's really exciting to see the growth. And what I've seen is, especially in the schools who have repurposed their intervention time as a next lesson in the scope and sequence model, like a double dip, those kids are increasing their outcomes, much stronger than what we have ever seen before, even when we went ahead and implemented skill-based grouping. So skill-based grouping alone is not enough to close the gap for those kids. It does improve outcomes for sure. We do see more growth, but it's still not going to be enough to close the gap. They must have a double pass or a second opportunity to get the next lesson in the scope and sequence, because the gap is going to stay the same size if we don't accelerate them.
Absolutely. I think people are going to want to contact you after this and be like, and ask a bunch of questions. How do people get in contact with you?
Yes, well, you can always reach me at Mount St. Joseph University. So Mount St. Joseph University's Graduate Reading Science program, that's a great place to find me. My email through the Mount is Jamey, Jamey, Peavler, P as in Paul, EA, V as in Victor, LER, at msj.edu. And I would be happy to answer questions, also happy to share some models of implementation that many schools have already used and found success with. And we've got K through 12 schools using this differentiated model with constrained skills and having success, not just in ELA, but also in math, because math falls into that same bucket of constrained and unconstrained skills. And just, as a quick aside, we are not doing enough fact fluency and developing those constrained skills to set kids up for success. So giving kids an opportunity to do that is really important.
Love it. Okay, Jamey, thank you so much. This was awesome. Listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to Progressively Incorrect. I love doing these episodes. I love this show. Even when I wake up at 7 a.m. Pacific time, it is still the highlight of my day. I would just appreciate if you pass this around. Like, there is zero marketing funds going into this podcast. It is entirely word of mouth. Just giving it to a principal who's like new and heard this episode and was like, I actually don't know how to set up an implementation for reading, especially in the realm of what the new term we learned today, which was constrained skills. They could listen to this episode and they could all of a sudden start, reaching out to Jamey and reaching out to Stephanie Staller and whatever else, and all of a sudden they grow professionally. So if you could pass that around, I'd really appreciate it. And otherwise, Jamey, thank you so much. Take care.
Great. Thanks for having me.